Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois, into a family that had endured many tragedies. His father, a World War II veteran, was killed when Ronald was only 10 years old. This event had a profound effect on his psyche and was likely one of the factors that led to his violent behavior in the future. His childhood was filled with cruelty, which may have been the reason for his aggressive and controlling personality in adulthood. Simmons joined the U.S. Navy in 1957 at the age of 17 and soon began serving in various units, including highly classified divisions. He proved himself to be a good soldier, but his personal life left much to be desired. He married Rebecca Becky Yulee Bari in 1960, and they had 7 children. Simmons was a harsh and domineering husband, controlling every aspect of his wife and children's lives. He forced Becky to give up cosmetics, wear only long dresses, and forbade her from communicating with her relatives. All of this was done under the pretext that he was supposedly caring for his family, but in reality, it was part of his psychopathic behavior. Shortly after serving in the Army, Simmons began working in various low-paying jobs, but his personal life became increasingly strained. He increasingly isolated his family from the outside world, controlling their every move, which gradually led to the destruction of their relationship. His behavior became increasingly violent, and despite his problems with the law, he continued to manipulate his family. In 1981, Simmons was arrested on charges of incest with his daughter Sheila, but despite this, the case was closed, and he continued his life with his family, who were increasingly withdrawn and isolated. In 1987, when Ronald's family situation became tense, he began to feel that he was losing control. This led him to decide to take extreme measures to regain his power in the family. On the night of December 22, 1987, Ronald decided to commit a terrible act. He killed his wife and eldest son using violence and a weapon. Then, in order to cover up his actions, he also killed other members of his family. Everything was carefully planned, and in order not to leave any traces, he hid the bodies in a place that had been prepared in advance and dug for other purposes. As a result of the tragedy, several members of his family died. Ronald was extremely cold-blooded in his actions, and he felt no remorse for what he had done. After everything was over, he went to the city and continued his rampage. On December 26th, during the holidays, Simmons went to the city of Russellville, where he killed several more people, including former colleagues and random passers-by. He shot his former colleague Katie Kendrick and then wounded several other people. After that, he went to a store, where he opened fire again. At that moment, the police began to monitor his actions. Ultimately, when Simmons arrived at his workplace, he was arrested. When he was detained, he immediately admitted his guilt and did not try to hide his actions. Simmons was firmly convinced that he was right and showed no remorse. He even waived all appeals, insisting that he be executed as soon as possible. This made his case unusual, as he was the first convict in Arkansas to waive his right to appeal and voluntarily accept death. After a trial in which numerous pieces of evidence of his crimes were presented, including ballistic tests and eyewitness testimony, Simmons was found guilty of murdering 14 people. The jury, after considering all the circumstances of the case, handed down a death sentence. On June 25, 1990, 2.5 years after the murders, Simmons was executed at the Arkansas State Penitentiary. His execution was carried out by lethal injection, and he became the first person to be executed by this method in the state. Simmons remained steadfast until the end, showing neither remorse nor fear of his death. Marian Albert Puit was born on October 4, 1949, and left his mark on U.S. history as a violent serial killer. His life, filled with crime and violence, led to his death sentence, which was carried out in 1999. However, the path Puit took before his execution was full of confusing events and contradictions. At the beginning of his criminal career, Puit was involved in various crimes, including bank robberies, murders, and other acts of violence. However, his life took an unexpected turn in 1979 when he became part of the U.S. Federal Witness Protection Program. Puit was given a new name and moved to a new location after testifying in a murder case that took place in a federal prison in Atlanta. In exchange, he received a new name, Charles Sonny Pearson, and $800. However, Puit later confessed that he had actually committed the murder, which contradicted his original testimony and called into question his participation in the Witness Protection Program. After entering the Witness Protection Program, Puit began a new wave of crimes, hiding under an alias. In 1981, he kidnapped and murdered Peggy Lowe, who worked at a bank in Jackson, Mississippi, after robbing the bank. This murder was one of many for which Puit was convicted. He also killed Bobby Jean Robertson, a convenience store clerk in Arkansas, as well as 2 other people in Colorado. His crimes were brutal, and he received death sentences for each murder. In the end, Puit was convicted of multiple murders and received the death penalty for the murder of Lowe, as well as 2 life sentences for the murders in Colorado. However, one of the most shocking crimes Puit was convicted of occurred in 1981 when he killed his common-law wife, Pamela Sue Barker. Puit admitted to robbing his wife to support his drug addiction, but denied killing her. Barker was beaten to death and burned. Despite his denial, Puit was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for this murder. While on death row, Puit continued his criminal activities, attempting to manipulate the system. He offered a Mississippi newspaper $20,000 in exchange for information about the location of his wife's wedding ring and the body of another victim. Puit also expressed a desire to promote his media presence by offering to appear on popular shows, such as Geraldo, in exchange for information about other crimes. Finally, on April 12, 1999, after many years on death row, Puit was executed in Arkansas. His execution was carried out by lethal injection. His last meal consisted of a variety of foods, including pizza, 4 Whoppers, French fries, and several 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. Puit said he planned to share his last meal with another inmate who was also scheduled to be executed that day. His last words were that he had originally wanted to eat roast duck, but his request had been denied. On April 12, 1999, Puit was executed at 8:04 p.m. and pronounced dead 5 minutes later. He was the 19th person to be executed in Arkansas since the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Furman v. Georgia, which allowed the state to resume capital punishment. Randy William Gay was born on September 1, 1958, and became known as an American serial killer. His life was filled with tragedy, violence, and alcoholism, which are said to have been the cause of the many crimes he committed over several decades. He killed 3 people, including his father-in-law and biological father, as well as a woman with whom he had an argument. After a series of murders, Gay was sentenced to death for one of his crimes. Randy's early childhood was marred by the absence of his mother, who left him and his sisters when they were still children. Left with his father, Glenn Harold Gay, Randy faced cruelty and strict upbringing. His father, although he tried to care for his children, was very strict and sometimes cruel, which left a mark on Randy's psyche. Gloria Lindsay, Randy's older sister, claimed that she understood her brother because she herself had seen how he suffered from their father's cruelty. In addition, at the age of 6, Randy was sexually abused by older boys, which may also have influenced his future behavior. Shortly after his mother left the family, Randy's father remarried, but his relationship with his stepmother was also unstable. According to his sister, Randy often defended his stepmother, which only exacerbated the tension in the family. Over time, his alcohol problems only intensified, leading to frequent arguments and aggression. Randy was married 3 times. His first marriage to a woman named Sherry Buford ended in divorce after his first murder. His second marriage to Janice Cochran was also problematic. Both spouses suffered from alcoholism, which caused their quarrels and unstable relationship. Cochran also claimed that Randy was very irritable and that his violence manifested itself in his relationship with her. His third marriage to Deborah Ann Powell also ended in divorce after numerous violent arguments and infidelities. Despite all his attempts, Randy was unable to overcome his addiction, which made his life unbearable for both himself and his loved ones. Randy's first murder took place on August 12, 1978, when he killed his father-in-law, James Kelly. An argument between them led Randy to shoot Kelly with a shotgun, claiming it was in self-defense. Although prosecutors agreed to a plea bargain, Randy was sentenced to 10 years, but was released on parole after only 9 months. However, his release did not mark the beginning of a new life. Randy continued to violate the terms of his parole, for which he was sent back to prison. His problems with alcohol and aggression continued to fuel conflicts. The second murder occurred on May 4, 1991, when Randy killed his biological father, Glenn Gay. According to Janice Cochran, Randy and his father began arguing while fishing, and Randy soon shot Glenn in the head. After the murder, Randy attempted to cover up the crime, but soon turned himself into the police and was arrested. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but was released on parole in 2000. After several years of struggling with alcohol addiction and violence, Randy continued to lead a destructive lifestyle. In 2006, he began working at John Ward's store, who later witnessed Randy's threats. His alcohol addiction and aggression continued to ruin his life, leading to another incident involving death threats. In 2008, he was found guilty of making threats and sentenced to 12 years probation. Randy's third murder occurred on May 10, 2011, when he killed a woman named Connie Ann Snow, with whom he had an argument at a logging site. He shot her and dumped her body in the Wichita National Forest. He was arrested the next day. James Webburn Hall was born on January 28, 1921, in Pulaski County, Arkansas, into a family whose members seem to have played a significant role in shaping his personality. His father, Samuel Jerome Hall, was a strict and violent man known for his harsh parenting, which left a mark on James's psyche from an early age. At the age of 12, Hall suffered a head injury, presumably as a result of abuse by his father, which may have been the beginning of his path to aggression and violence in the future. From an early age, James showed a tendency to wander and left school in 1937. He traveled around the country, staying in places such as Kansas and Detroit. In 1938, he met his first wife, with whom he had a son, but the child died in infancy. After his divorce in 1943, Hall was drafted into the U.S. Navy, but was discharged after 8 weeks for desertion. This event was an important milestone in his life, after which he committed a series of murders, including the murder of his second wife, Faye Clemens, which marked the beginning of his criminal career. On September 14, 1944, James killed his 19-year-old wife, whom he had met a few months earlier. At that point, even though they had only been married for 6 months, their relationship was strained. On the evening of September 14th, after an argument in the car, he drove his wife to a road near the Arkansas River, where he brutally murdered her by striking her multiple times in the head. Shortly after the murder, he told the Clemens family that she was missing, but the police were unable to find evidence linking Hall to her disappearance, and the case was soon closed. However, 2 weeks later, when Hall was arrested, the police found evidence pointing to his guilt. Between January and February 1945, Hall killed 3 more men whom he met while hitchhiking in Little Rock. These murders were carried out with the same brutality, and all of the victims were shot with the same gun. The murders committed during this time were a continuation of a violent crime spree that included murders committed by Hall in various states, such as Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. In March 1945, after Hall was arrested, he confessed to the murder of his wife and also recounted other crimes he had committed between 1938 and 1945. His confessions included at least 24 murders, although only 4 crimes were confirmed. James also confessed to murders committed in Kansas, Texas, and elsewhere, describing each murder as part of his uncontrollable aggression and desire to destroy the lives of others. In 1945, Hall stood trial for the murder of his wife. He attempted to plead insanity, but a psychiatric evaluation found him sane, and he was convicted of first-degree murder. In May of that year, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty, and the judge sentenced him to death by electric chair. In his final statement before his execution, James said, "Guys, I'm not afraid. I can take it," showing a strange calmness in the face of imminent death. James Webburn Hall's execution took place on January 4th, 1946. On that day, he was executed in the electric chair at Tucker Prison, and his death marked the end of his bloody path. Kenneth Dwayne Williams was born on February 23, 1979 in Arkansas, into a family that faced serious problems. His parents struggled with education, and his mother suffered from drug addiction and smoke during pregnancy. Williams' father was a violent man who often resorted to abuse, both towards his mother and his children. Williams, who was subjected to abuse, began to experience psychological and emotional problems at an early age, which later led him to criminal behavior. At the age of 6, he tried marijuana for the first time, and at 9, he joined the Gangster Disciples gang, which only exacerbated his propensity for violence. From an early age, Kenneth experienced many traumas, including sexual abuse, which left a deep mark on his psyche. As he later admitted, this shaped his desire to take revenge on those around him for his pain, which became the basis of his violent nature. Already as a teenager, Williams realized that in order to survive, he had to become a predator, not a victim. His life became a series of crimes, ranging from minor offenses to serious violent crimes. In 1996, Williams was sentenced to 5 years for escaping from prison and assault. However, he was released early in 1998 and soon committed his first murder. On December 13, 1998, he kidnapped University of Arkansas medical student Dominique Hurd and her boyfriend Peter Robertson. After forcing them into his car and robbing them, he brutally murdered Hurd by shooting her, while Robertson miraculously survived. After the murder, Williams burned their car to cover up the crime. He was sentenced to life in prison for this crime. However, less than a year later, on October 3, 1999, Williams managed to escape from prison by hiding in a 500-gallon barrel of pig slurry that was being transported by truck. After his escape, he committed another murder. At the home of farmer Cecil Boren, Williams stole a gun and killed him, then continued his escape. In Missouri, sometime later, he was involved in a police chase that ended tragically. He crashed into another car, killing the driver, Michael Greenwood. Williams was arrested after the chase, but at trial he was not charged with Greenwood's death, but was charged with the murder of Boren. For this crime, he was sentenced to death. During the investigation, Williams confessed to another murder, the murder of 36-year-old Gerald Jenkins, which he committed on the day of Hurd's murder. Jenkins was shot with a pistol, and his body was found later. After his confessions and other admissions of murder, Williams was sentenced to death. In 2005, while on death row, he wrote a letter of apology and confession, asking for forgiveness for his actions. He also confessed that he had encountered God, which gave him the strength to admit his crimes and ask for forgiveness from all his victims. His life, full of violence, remorse, and the search for forgiveness, ended on April 27, 2017, when he was executed in the electric chair in Arkansas. Williams was the last of 4 prisoners executed in that state that year. Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton were 2 prisoners whose names went down in history not only because of their crimes, but also because of the brutality with which they committed them. Beginning their criminal journey with an escape from prison, they embarked on a trail of violence that did not stop until their execution. Their story is one of people whose fates became forever intertwined with murder and the destruction of many lives. In 1977, after Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton escaped from an Oklahoma state prison, A bloody series of murders began that swept across several states. Their escape was organized with the help of another inmate, but it was Ruiz and Denton who became the main figures in this tragedy. Both had a long history of trouble with the law, each having been convicted of serious crimes such as murder and robbery. Denton was convicted of murder in 1970, while Ruiz committed armed robbery. After their escape, the men immediately began committing crimes. A few days after their escape, their victim was Gerald Tiffey, a young man who had disappeared in Oklahoma and was suspected of being the victim of the two fugitives. Although his body was never found, it was known that his truck had been stolen, which confirmed their involvement in the crime. The next episode was the murder of Jimmy Cockrell in Louisiana. Ruiz and Denton encountered him while he was resting near his motorcycle. With no reason to stop their victim, they killed him and then left the scene of the crime. This murder was the first in a chain of violence that was only gaining momentum. A little later, two fishermen, Ray Jones and Elton Wilson, became their victims in Louisiana. Both men disappeared, and their bodies were found only a few months later. The autopsy showed that they had been killed, but not by gunshots, which left many questions unanswered. The killings continued, and by this time, Ruiz and Denton could no longer hide from investigators. The next murder was even more brutal. In Arkansas, they killed two law enforcement officers, Marshal Marvin Ritchie and Park Ranger Opal Lee James. It was a kidnapping and murder that was a real tragedy for their families and those who knew them personally. Ritchie, like James, died from gunshot wounds, and their bodies were found sometime after the crime. Next was the murder of taxi driver James Melvin Short in Oklahoma. He was first kidnapped and then killed. The truck stolen during the crime served as their getaway vehicle, and this continued until the couple was caught in Portland, Oregon, in early July 1977. That was the moment their violent career came to an end. They were arrested and extradited back to Arkansas, where they stood trial for the murders of two law enforcement officers. The trial was long and painful. The jury found Ruiz and Denton guilty of the murders of Ritchie and James, and both were sentenced to death. The trial was accompanied by numerous appeals, and both prisoners attempted to avoid punishment. They filed numerous petitions for review of their sentences, but all were denied. The judicial system was relentless, and in the end, despite all attempts, the sentence was carried out. On January 8, 1997, after many years on death row and numerous appeals, Paul Ruiz and Earl Van Denton were executed by lethal injection at Cummins Prison. Frederick Jackson was born on July 11, 2004, in Little Rock, Arkansas, and from the very beginning of his life, his circumstances were far from ideal. He grew up in an environment of violence, both at home and in society. From an early age, Jackson found himself in the spotlight of law enforcement. Between 2015 and 2018, several calls were made to the police regarding his behavior. He repeatedly threatened and acted aggressively toward others, including assisting in a fight that resulted in injuries to a 14-year-old student. His problems did not seem to be addressed in a timely manner, and as events in subsequent years would show, they played a fateful role in his future. His family also experienced tragic events. In 2019, just a few years after Jackson became a teenager, his uncle Bradley Blackshire was shot and killed by a Little Rock police officer, which undoubtedly had a profound effect on the teenager's psyche. Even more tragic was the death of his mother, who was shot in 2020 while in her last month of pregnancy. Such upheavals only intensified his feelings of hopelessness and rage, which probably catalyzed his subsequent actions. Jackson found himself in a deep emotional and psychological pit from which it was extremely difficult and seemingly impossible to escape. Many tried to help Jackson, but his life continued to spiral into violence and crime. In June 2020, he was involved in a serious crime for the first time. On June 2nd, 2020, he murdered Nicholas Jones, marking the beginning of a long series of murders that continued for another 2 years. A few days later, on June 15th of the same year, Jackson killed another person, Deshaun Allen. These murders were just the beginning of what would later become a series of ruthless crimes that left many lives destroyed in their wake. Another murder followed in 2021. On February 20th, 2021, Jackson killed Dante Stanley, and then more than a year later, on April 7th, 2022, he killed Dolan Goff. All of these deaths were the result not only of cruelty, but also of Jackson's desire for violence, which he had exhibited from an early age. His ability to commit such crimes at such a young age seemed to leave no chance for a normal life. Each of Jackson's murders was devoid of any meaning or explanation other than a violent manifestation of his aggression, caused by personal tragedies and inner demons. When Jackson was arrested, the public was shocked that a teenager had become such a violent criminal. The reaction to his crimes was immediate. Little Rock Mayor Frank Scott Jr. expressed concern that one of the most violent criminals in their city was a teenager. His words that Jackson was responsible for numerous crimes sounded like an alarm bell, that society was facing a serious problem related to youth violence. After his arrest, Frederick Jackson pleaded guilty to the murders. During the trial, it was decided that he would be sentenced to 50 years in prison. Arkansas state law stipulates that after serving 70% of their sentence, convicts can apply for early release. But since Jackson was a minor at the time of the crimes, his first hearing on possible release will only take place in 25 years, in 2047, when he will be 42 years old. The guilty plea did little to ease the suffering of the victims' families. The pain of losing their loved ones will remain with them for the rest of their lives. For many of them, it was not just grief, but also a feeling of helplessness in the face of someone who was still a teenager, causing such terrible losses. According to the city's mayor, Jackson became a vivid example of how uncontrolled rage and unresolved issues in adolescence can lead to tragic consequences. Jack Harold Jones Jr. was an American serial killer whose crimes shocked the nation. He was born on August 10, 1964, but his life was anything but normal. As a child, Jones was abused, which according to some experts, may have been one of the reasons for his later criminal tendencies. However, despite his difficult childhood, Jack grew up and soon became known for a series of horrific crimes, including the murders of women he committed in the 1980s and 1990s. One of the first murders associated with Jonas's name was the murder of 20-year-old student Regina Harrison. This crime occurred on May 2, 1983, when Regina went on a bike ride but did not return home. A few days later, her body was found in Westlake Park in Hollywood, Florida. She had been strangled, and the circumstances of the murder remained unclear for a long time. However, the investigation only progressed after a Fort Lauderdale detective noted the similarity between Ronald Henry Stewart, a serial rapist, and a sketch of the suspect that had been compiled from eyewitness accounts. Stewart was arrested and confessed to the murder, despite the lack of evidence to support his guilt. However, it later emerged that Stewart was not the person who actually killed Regina. The case was reviewed, and as the investigation continued, DNA linked to other crimes led to Jack Jones being identified as the real killer. This discovery was a major turning point in his case. The second murder for which Jones was convicted was the murder of Lorraine Lori Ann Barrett. This tragedy occurred on June 1st, 1991. Lori was killed in Florida, in a motel where her body was found a few hours after she disappeared. The woman had been raped and strangled, and it was only several years later, when Jones was already in prison, that his DNA was matched to evidence in the case, confirming his guilt. Another of Jones' most brutal crimes was the murder of Mary Phillips in 1995 in Arkansas. Mary was killed in her office, and her daughter Lacey, beaten into a coma, miraculously survived. When Lacey regained consciousness, she gave a description of the perpetrator, which soon led to the identification of Jack Jones. This murder was the culmination of his criminal career, as it was his confession to this crime that led to his arrest and conviction. As a result of his actions, Jack Jones was sentenced to death for the murder of Mary Phillips, and his DNA was entered into a nationwide database, which linked him to other murders. Despite his imprisonment, appeals filed by Jones and his defense attorneys did not result in the death sentence being overturned. His death was only a matter of time, and he continued to wait on death row in an Arkansas prison. On April 24, 2017, Jack Jones was executed at Cummins Prison. It was a double execution, in which another criminal, Marcel Williams, was also executed. Jones and Williams were the first criminals executed in Arkansas in 2017, and this execution was the first double execution in the United States in 17 years. On the day of his execution, Jones did not say his last words, but his actions and confessions ultimately led to his death. Before his execution, Jack Jones gave his sister a letter he had written in 2006, asking her to open it after his execution. In the letter, he confessed to the murder of Regina Harrison, providing details that only the real killer could have known. This confession was the key to solving his other crimes, and in 2019, the Broward County State Attorney's Office officially found him guilty of Regina's murder, overturning the conviction of Ronald Stewart, who had previously been found guilty. Mark Edward Gardner was born on May 4, 1956, and became one of those whose name has come to symbolize violence and cruelty. His story is linked to a tragedy that shook not only his home state, but the entire country. Gardner became known as a murderer whose crimes caused unbearable pain to several families, and his actions ultimately led to his execution in 1999. But the road to that moment was long and full of violent crimes that became part of his tragic life. In 1985, when Gardner was 29, he committed crimes that left an indelible mark on the lives of Joe and Martha Joyce's family. It all started when Joe returned home from a funeral and his daughter Sarah, an adult woman, came to her parents' house for lunch while her husband was away on business. They had no idea that their lives would turn into a tragedy and that their home would become the scene of horrific events. Gardner, who was on parole at the time for armed robbery, came to their house and tied up the whole family. He used duct tape to immobilize them and then strangled them. Joe and Martha Joyce, as well as their daughter Sarah, who was raped and murdered, had no chance of survival. All this happened in their own home, which was later ransacked. Gardner stole jewelry in the family car. When the criminal was arrested, many of his past actions became known. Some of the stolen items were found on him at the time of his arrest. During questioning, he confessed to the murders and told the police that he had also killed another person in New York. But in court, he claimed that demons had forced him to commit these murders, which, of course, did not save him from punishment. Gardner was convicted of the murders of Joe and Martha Joyce, as well as the rape and murder of their daughter Sarah. He was sentenced to death. But Gardner's story did not end there. He was subsequently involved in another crime. He was accused of raping and beating another inmate, Damian E. Coles, who had been convicted of murders in West Memphis. E. Coles was later released, and his case became well known in the context of other trials at the time. Gardner was executed on September 8, 1999, at the age of 43. His last meal included fried shrimp, grilled salmon, garden salad, and chocolate cake with cola. Gardner was the first to be executed that day, as he had a lower identification number than another inmate, Alan Willett, whose execution was also scheduled for that day. The lethal injection was administered at 8:02 p.m., and he was pronounced dead 13 minutes later at 8:15 p.m. Before his death, Gardner uttered his last words, "Blessed are those who are called to the Lord's Supper. An endless feast awaits me. I love Melanie Alberson's family and am very grateful to them." These words were not recognized as repentance for his crimes, but rather reflected his faith and search for inner reconciliation. Gardner became the third convict sentenced to death in Arkansas in 1999, and the 20th person executed in the state since the adoption of new death penalty laws in 1973. Ronald James Ward Jr. was an American serial killer whose crimes shook several states, including Arkansas, over the years. Born in 1966 in Hood River, Oregon, he had a tragic and turbulent life that grew darker with each passing year. His criminal path began with his involvement in numerous violent incidents, including those related to drugs and violence. When he was 19, his family broke up, which marked the beginning of his problems with the law and drugs. Although he initially lived a relatively quiet life, his drug addiction and involvement in crime began to destroy everything he had ever had. In 2000, Ward committed a series of brutal murders, many of which took place in Arkansas. All of his victims were typically women. These murders were the culmination of his criminal activity, which began long before his name became known throughout the state. Ward, having lost all connection to reality after a series of personal tragedies and drug addiction, killed women in various states, including Arkansas. On August 25, 2000, the day Ronald Ward killed his first victim, Christine Laurit, she stopped at a secluded rest stop on Interstate 40 in Arkansas to let her dogs play and refresh themselves. It was at that moment that her life was tragically cut short. Ward, intoxicated and with several drugs in his possession, stumbled upon Laurit and brutally attacked her. He raped and then killed her with multiple stab wounds. He left the woman's body behind at a rest stop, and her dogs were the first to alert authorities to the victim's whereabouts. This murder was only the beginning of his criminal journey, which led to even more violence in Arkansas. After this murder, Ward continued his violent streak, moving south to his next victim, Craig Petrish, whom he met at a trailer park in Hamilton, Montana. Ward and Petrick began to argue, and as a result of a drunken fight, Ward killed Petrick and hid his body in the Sapphire Mountains. However, it was in Arkansas that Ward began to actively seek refuge, and his murders became more cold-blooded and calculated. At the end of 2000, he committed another murder, that of Jackie Travis, a 49-year-old woman living in Jonesboro, Arkansas. Travis, who had survived a car accident and lost a leg, fell victim to Ward. She was killed in her home, raped, and then brutally beaten and burned. Her murder was also linked to his previous crimes in Arkansas, as he frequently visited her apartment and prowled the area until he decided to kill her. In addition, that same year, in Arkansas, Ronald killed another woman, Sheila Polly, a homeless divorcee who was planning to start a new life in Las Vegas. Ward, upon meeting her, also killed her, subjecting her to brutal violence and then dumping her body in Dry Creek. All of these murders became defining moments in Ward's life, who seemed unable to stop on this path. After a series of murders in Arkansas and other states, Ward was arrested in Merced, California, and extradited to Montana, where he was tried for Petrick's murder. His confessions and further investigations linked him to other murders. During the trial, it was established that he was guilty of the deaths of Christine Laurit and several other victims linked to his travels across the country. DNA evidence finally confirmed his involvement in the murders, and Ward was convicted. In 2007, years after his imprisonment, Ward was sentenced to an additional life sentence for the murder of Christine Laurit in Arkansas, despite his claims that he had no memory of his actions. He was unable to escape punishment for his crimes, and his punishment was further exacerbated by court decisions related to his actions in other states. On April 11, 2014, at the age of 48, Ronald James Ward was found dead in his cell. Although the exact cause of his death was not disclosed, medical examiners stated that there were no signs of violence in his death. Charles Laverne Singleton was born on March 29, 1959 in the United States. He became known for his crime, which attracted public attention and led to a lengthy trial. Singleton was executed in 2004 for the 1979 murder of 19-year-old Mary Lou York. His case became the subject of lengthy debates related to his mental state, issues of justice, and the use of the death penalty in the United States. On June 19, 1979, Singleton committed a crime that forever changed not only his life, but also the life of his victim, and led to lengthy proceedings in the legal system. On that day, Singleton attacked Mary Lou York, who ran a grocery store in a small town. He killed her with 2 stab wounds, causing her to bleed to death. Information was found at the crime scene indicating that Singleton had been identified as the perpetrator. York, while still conscious, was able to tell the police that Singleton was her attacker. Several witnesses also confirmed his involvement in the crime. This was evidence of his clear guilt. After his arrest, Singleton began to claim that he had committed the murder under the influence of demons, which may have indicated his mental disorder. In subsequent years, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, which led to lengthy legal proceedings. In 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Ford v. Wainwright that the execution of the mentally ill is unconstitutional, as such individuals cannot comprehend the reality of their actions and the consequences of punishment. This ruling raised serious questions about the legality of Singleton's execution, as he was suffering from mental illness at the time. In Singleton's case, the question of his mental state and the legality of his execution became the main subject of controversy in the U.S. legal system. His lawyers argued that despite treatment, he was not sane enough to carry out the punishment, as his mental illness prevented him from understanding his actions and the consequences of the death penalty. On the other hand, prosecutors and government officials insisted that Singleton, despite his schizophrenia, was able to understand the reasons for his punishment and should be held responsible for his crime. Initial attempts to execute Singleton were suspended due to his mental state and his inability to understand the consequences of his actions. However, after several years of appeals and case reviews, the judicial system ultimately decided that Singleton was sane and could be executed. His execution was postponed several times, including due to his health and questions about his mental capacity. But in 2004, after Singleton began voluntarily taking medication, his mental state stabilized and the decision to execute him was made. Singleton's execution was scheduled for January 6, 2004. He became the 26th person to be executed in Arkansas since the state reinstated the death penalty in 1973. Singleton was executed by lethal injection. John Edward Swindler was an American murderer whose case became a landmark in the history of the state of Arkansas. Born on May 12, 1944, Swindler is known not only for his crime, but also for being the first person executed in Arkansas since 1964, and the only one to be executed in the electric chair in the state since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1973. His murder of police officer Randy Basnett in 1976 was the culmination of a criminal career that also included a series of other crimes. Swindler was a man whose life was filled with crime. He was a con artist and swindler who had been in and out of prison for various offenses, including theft, fraud, and armed robbery. His life in the criminal world began with petty offenses, but his crimes gradually became more serious. By 1976, when the incident involving the murder of a police officer occurred, Swindler was already well known to the authorities. On September 24, 1976, the day Swindler killed Officer Basnett, his life changed dramatically. On that day, he was spotted at a gas station in Fort Smith, Arkansas, driving a stolen car with South Carolina license plates. The police were looking for him on suspicion of murdering 2 teenagers in South Carolina. When police officer Randy Basnett approached Swindler's car and asked for his ID, Swindler pulled out a gun without warning and shot Basnett twice. The officer returned fire but was fatally wounded. Swindler attempted to flee, but, unfamiliar with the area, found himself in a dead end and was apprehended by police within minutes. The moment of his arrest was decisive for the trial. Swindler was charged with the murder of Officer Basnett and other crimes. Apparently, his motivation was related to his past in the criminal world and his failed plan to save his own skin. During the investigation, it was established that Swindler not only killed Basnett, but was also involved in other murders and crimes, including the murders of teenagers in South Carolina. His life was full of violence, deception, and manipulation, which made him a dangerous criminal deserving of the most severe punishment. The trial resulted in a death sentence. However, unlike other prisoners who were offered a choice between lethal injection and the electric chair, Swindler refused to make a choice, resulting in his execution being scheduled for the electric chair, the last execution in Arkansas by this method. Swindler became the first person executed in Arkansas after the death penalty was reinstated in 1973. His execution attracted public attention because it was unique for the state. In particular, it was the first execution carried out on a new electric chair, built specifically for carrying out death sentences. This event also became an important moment in the context of the debate on the death penalty in the United States. John Edward Swindler was executed on June 18, 1990. His death ended a long legal process that included numerous appeals and was an important event for the state, as his execution was the first since the reinstatement of the death penalty. Brandon Dwayne Johnson was born on January 18, 1988, in Little Rock, Arkansas. He became involved in crime at an early age. His criminal career began when he was placed on probation for car theft and check fraud. But his attempts to change his life quickly led to new crimes, much more serious than his previous offenses. Between September 2008 and January 2009, Johnson was responsible for a series of violent robberies and murders in Little Rock and the surrounding area, in which 3 people were killed and 8 were injured. According to Johnson himself, his actions were motivated by bad friends and bad decisions. But in reality, these were crimes committed with brutal cold-bloodedness. Johnson began his crime spree in September 2008, committing several armed robberies using a .380 caliber pistol. His victims were mainly Hispanic. He was confident that he could easily avoid punishment as he carefully selected his victims and avoided contact with people who could testify against him. However, things soon changed. On November 15th, Johnson met Armando Guerrero and Andy Tapia as they were leaving a friend's apartment. He asked them for their phone, but when they refused, he pulled out a gun and demanded money. He then shot Guerrero, who miraculously survived. This crime was followed by another. On November 17th, Johnson attacked Jairo Castorin Mendez, who was leaving his home to go to work. Wearing a mask again, Johnson tried to attack the man, and although Castorina Mendez managed to close the door, Johnson shot through it and wounded him. However, this man also survived the attack. By December 10, 2008, his crimes had become even more violent. Johnson continued his robberies and attacks, sparing no one. Among other things, he attacked Carlos Lario, shot him in the arm, and later killed 50-year-old Joseph Bittengull, an associate professor at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences, who happened to be among his victims. But the most horrific of his crimes was the murder on January 13, 2009. That day, Johnson met Akshay Nandam and Eric Herman, 2 young men, and committed his most brutal crimes against them. He shot Nandam, took his wallet, and left him to die, and later shot Herman. These 2 murders completed a series of 4 crimes involving murder. After his arrest, Johnson pleaded guilty to 3 murders and several robberies. However, despite his confessions, he claimed that he was merely an observer and not an active participant in the crimes. Psychological tests showed that Johnson suffered from mental retardation, which raised doubts about his ability to be subject to the death penalty. After consulting with the victims' families, the prosecution agreed to a deal in which Johnson pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 100 years in prison. At the hearing, Johnson apologized for his actions, but his explanation for his behavior remained unconvincing to the judge. When asked why he committed the murders, Johnson said it was the result of poor judgment. The judge, dissatisfied with this explanation, reminded him of his letter in which he claimed that he committed the robberies to get food and diapers for his children. Johnson then admitted that this was a lie. Despite his confessions and sentence, Brandon Johnson did not escape his crimes. He continued to break the rules in prison, committing more than 30 offenses, including assaulting other inmates, possessing contraband, and disobeying orders. His last chance for parole was set for 2071, when he will be 83 years old. Grant Harden, born and raised in northern Arkansas, showed an interest in law enforcement from an early age. However, his career in the police force was marred by numerous incidents involving violence and abuse of authority. While working in several small towns in the northwest of the state, Harden was violent towards citizens and his colleagues, which led to his dismissal from several positions. Harden was initially hired by the Fayetteville Police Department, but quickly ran into difficulties. His behavior, particularly his use of excessive force, led to his dismissal. Instead of reflecting on his actions and changing his attitude, Harden continued to seek employment with law enforcement agencies. He went through several departments, including police departments in Huntsville and Eureka Springs, before his career ended as police chief in the small town of Gateways in 2016. All these years, Harden remained a problem for his profession, but he continued to be hired despite his past. In 2017, Grant Harden committed a murder that left a trail of blood. James Appleton, a 59-year-old laborer, was shot to death. This murder led to his arrest, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the crime. However, his crimes did not end there. It soon emerged that Harden was also involved in the rape of an elementary school teacher in Rogers, and his DNA matched the evidence obtained from that case. He was sentenced to an additional 50 years in prison for this crime. Before completing his sentence, Harden ended up in Calico Rock Prison, where he was convicted of murder. But unexpectedly, on May 25, 2025, Harden made a daring escape. He pretended to be a prison employee, and the guards allowed him to leave the prison through a specially opened gate. After that, a large-scale search operation began, which lasted about a week and a half. All possible forces participated in the search, from local police officers to federal agents using helicopters and drones. Despite the heavy rains, which made the work of search dogs difficult, the search continued. However, on June 6, 2025, Harden was finally found and detained just 1.5 miles from the prison. He tried to escape but was quickly apprehended. At the time of his arrest, his health was checked, but no serious injuries were found. Despite this, law enforcement officials expressed their relief that the criminal had finally been caught and no longer posed a threat to society. After his arrest, a real storm broke out in the press and on social media. Many people, including Harden's victims and their families, expressed relief that he would no longer be able to commit crimes. The question of how he managed to evade justice for so long became a hot topic. Harden became a symbol of how the system can sometimes allow a person who is clearly unsuitable for law enforcement to continue living among people, putting them at risk. During the investigation, it was determined that Harden had always been an ambitious and confident person, but his ambitions were the reason for his destructive actions. He was willing to do anything to achieve his personal goals, which ultimately led to disastrous consequences. All attempts to turn his life around, including working for the police, ended in tragedy for those who crossed paths with him. In the end, after numerous crimes, Harden stood trial, where he was found guilty of murder and other serious crimes. The court sentenced him to a long prison term, which would likely keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Harden was in prison, where he continued his inappropriate behavior, committing more than 30 offenses. Chevy O'Brien Kiho, born in Orange Park, Florida, on January 29, 1973, was raised from an early age with extremely radical views. As a teenager, after moving to Washington State, he became part of a white separatist group that soon began engaging in criminal activity. Kiho was the leader of this organization, which aimed to create a white ethnic state in the Pacific Northwest, known as the Northwest Territorial Imperative. He was the main organizer of numerous crimes, such as robberies, thefts, and arms trafficking. In 1995, Chevy Kiho and his accomplices, including Daniel Lewis Lee, became known for their violent crimes. In particular, they kidnapped, robbed, and murdered several people, including arms dealers and other potential enemies of their cause. Between 1995 and 1997, Kiho and his associates committed a series of brutal murders, including murders in Arkansas, where they kidnapped and killed the Muller family, who were arms dealers. On January 11, 1996, Kiho and Lee arrived at the home of William Muller, who was a well-known arms dealer. Kiho and his accomplices expected to find a large amount of weapons and money. After the Muellers returned home, Kiho and Lee attacked them. They not only robbed the house, but also tortured Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their 8-year-old daughter Sarah, demanding information about the money and weapons. They then killed all three by strangulation, demonstrating their cold-blooded cruelty. The victims' bodies were dumped in a lake and were only found several months later in the waters of Lake Dardanelle in Arkansas. These murders became one of the most shocking crimes ever committed in the state. In addition to murdering the Muller family, Kiho also committed other crimes, such as robberies and murders, targeting people he considered a threat to his ideology. He and his accomplices attempted to create an atmosphere of fear and violence to promote their racist and anti-government beliefs. These crimes were not limited to Arkansas. Kiho and his group also actively committed crimes in other states, such as Washington and Idaho. Kiho was arrested in 1997 after his group was spotted in a shootout with police in Ohio. After several months on the run, he was caught, and his arrest was the result of a massive effort by law enforcement agencies, which used both traditional and high-tech methods to catch the criminals. During the trial, Kiho pleaded guilty to murder, but attempted to avoid the death penalty by claiming that he had acted under the influence of his ideology and personal beliefs. Nevertheless, in 1999, after lengthy legal proceedings, he was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The trial attracted a lot of public attention, as Kiho's racist ideology resonated widely with society. After his sentencing, Kiho was transferred to prison, where he continued to actively spread propaganda among inmates, trying to promote his extremist views. However, his attempts to influence other prisoners were unsuccessful. Ultimately, Kiho became one of the most dangerous criminals in the United States, and his story became one of the most famous examples of violence associated with radical groups and their ideologies.